Okay, thank you, and sorry for these complications. So, first of all, let me apologize for the fact that my English sounds a lot like French, but at least for those of you who know French, there should be no problem. So let me also say, how happy I am to be here in Beirut. This is my very first visit to Beirut, and I'm very happy to be there to talk about this book. I'm very glad that this book is now available in the Arabic language, and I thank a lot my publisher, the translator, for making this possible. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to present a number of results from the book, but I should say right away that unfortunately, the Middle East in general, and Lebanon in particular, Egypt, but all countries in the Middle East, are not as present in the book and also in this presentation than I would like them to be. That's partly because of lack of access to the proper data, but it's not the only reason. It's a big limitation of my work is that in many ways it's too much centered on the experience of Europe, North America, Japan, and not enough on other parts of the world. And this is really something I would like to change in the future. And I will try today to give a number of results about what we have done for the Middle East and other parts of the world, but this is too little. And the title of this presentation, maybe some of you will be disappointed by what I have to say on the Middle East, which is unfortunately limited, but I would like it to be less limited in the future. So this is going to be based mostly on my book. So this is a book where, for the first time, we have collected in a very systematic manner a lot of historical data on income and wealth with a large group of researchers. This comes from a very collective research project. This had never been done before to this extent, largely because this kind of historical fiscal data was viewed as too historical by economists, too economic by historians, so in the end nobody was really using it in a systematic manner. And also, of course, modern information technologies make it possible to collect this kind of data at a scale that was much more complicated before. So when Kuznets started to do that in the 1950s, he didn't have Excel, he did it everything almost by hand, so it's very different today. You can do it. It's much easier in a way to do this kind of research project today than it used to be a couple of decades ago. So today I will present a number of selected historical evolution coming from this project, but you can go online here to see all the data series, in particular on the World Wealth and Income Database. It's a database where we put online new data, new historical series on income and wealth inequality all the time. So the countries in red are already in the database. The countries in blue are partially entering the database, which means that we are starting to access the proper fiscal data. So as you can see, in the Middle East, there's not much color here because we were not able so far to access the data. Actually, a student, Lydia Aswad, is started to use income tax data from Lebanon very recently, but the data we had access to was very limited, and I will not be able to show you results at this stage. Certainly the general conclusion is that when you can access administrative tax data, even in countries where the tax system is maybe not working so well and there's a lot of tax evasion, you are able to measure a level of inequality that's higher and probably more realistic as compared to the official household survey data. So it's not perfect, income tax data is not perfect, but at least it's an improvement as compared to the official measures that we have with household survey, and also sometimes it allows you for a much longer run perspective because household survey are relatively recent, whereas income tax data in many countries is quite old. The modern income tax was created in 1913 in the US, 1914 in France, sometime in the late 19th century in a number of countries like Germany, Japan, Sweden. So you can do long-run study in a way which you could not do with other sources. So in this database, you can go online and look at all the series. We put new countries online all the time, and in particular, one of the positive impact of the publication of the book was to induce more government to open their fiscal data, for instance, Brazil or Mexico or Korea or Taiwan, which were not covered in the book. After the publication of the book, we could have access to the fiscal data, and they will, or they are partly online already. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to make 3 points. The first one will be about the long-run evolution of income inequality. The second one will be about the evolution of wealth accumulation, wealth inequality. So wealth is what you own, income is what you earn, so income is the flow of what you earn each year. Wealth is the stock of what you own in property, in real estate, in business assets, financial assets. So of course the evolution of wealth is partly determined by the evolution of income. If you have more inequality of wages, in the long run you will also have more inequality in property, but there are other important mechanisms that play a role for wealth, which I will talk about in the second part of this presentation. And then in the third part I will try to stress recent research looking at evolution in developing countries and in the post-colonial world. Before I start this presentation and I go through these 3 points, let me try to say a little more about what we know and don't know about inequality in the Middle East. And probably the main message is, as I said already before, we know very little about the levels of income and wealth inequality within Middle East countries. It's very difficult to do proper comparison with other parts of the world in our database, because there is no access to income tax data or to inheritance tax data, while in some countries there's no inheritance tax at all, so of course there is no data. But even in countries where you have an income tax, and usually there is an income tax pretty much everywhere, certainly in Lebanon, in Egypt, in most Middle East countries, we don't have access to the data. So we don't even know each year the number of taxpayers who have between 1 million and 2 million pounds, or 2 million and 3 million, 100,000, 500,000, is it wage income, rent? You don't need the name. The usual excuse for not publishing this kind of data is, okay, this is anonymous data, but you can publish it in an anonymous way. We don't care about the names of the people, but it's very important that countries publish this kind of data, and so far, unfortunately, we don't have it in the Middle East, so it's impossible to make reliable comparison with other countries. Official household survey tend to underestimate inequality a lot, so it's very difficult to say. Now, what we know is that you have a lot of inequality between Middle East countries, in particular due to the enormous concentration of oil resources in very small territories with limited population. So a simple comparison that I make in my book is, you look at a country like Egypt, who used to have 80 million population, but who now has 90 and will soon have 100. The total education budget is, for primary, secondary, tertiary education, is a couple of $1 billion as compared to several $100 billion for oil revenues for countries like the Emirates or Qatar, who have a citizen population which is around 1 million, 100 times less. So this is a few hundred kilometers away. So this kind of extreme inequality is something at the world level. If we try to measure income inequality at the level of the entire region of the Middle East, then even if we take as given the very low official inequality estimate within each country, but then we aggregate, we sum up all this official distribution at the level of the Middle East as a whole, there's no doubt that the region is the most unequal region in the world. With, I give an example here, the top 10% income share is at least 60% of total income, and it could be 70% if we had better measure of inequality within each country. So just to show you this simple result, so this is for Egypt, so this is the share going to the top 10%, this is the official measure for Egypt, coming from household survey. And this is probably not true. This is probably an underestimate. Probably the true level for Egypt, well, we don't know. Maybe it's in between, it's somewhere probably higher, but we don't know exactly where. But even if we take as given this official estimate, and we sum up all this official estimate for all Middle East countries, so the Middle East here is defined as the region from Egypt to Iran, through Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Gulf countries. So you have 280 million population as a whole for this region. So, of course, it's a very heterogeneous region, but the total size, there is also some form of homogeneity agriculture in some ways, or it makes sense, I think, to look at this region as a whole. The total population, 280 million, is roughly the same as the United States. It's comparable to Western Europe, it's comparable to Brazil. So, why not look at the level of inequality within this region? The conclusion you come with is that this is higher, much higher than Western Europe, higher than the US, higher than South Africa, higher than Brazil. And this is probably, and this is an underestimate. Again, remember, this number for the Middle East is based on very conservative estimate for inequality within each country. And from the preliminary data, from the income tax data that the student I was referring to earlier could use for Lebanon, the actual inequality in Lebanon or in other Middle East countries is probably a lot higher than the official estimate. So it means that this 60% maybe will go to 70%, we don't know exactly. So this is striking because, when we compare to South Africa or Brazil, South Africa, of course, this is a country that has the historical legacy of apartheid, so, you have about the white population is about 10% of the population, and this is basically the top 10%, and the other 90% of the white population. So this is quite, it's not exactly like this, but it's almost like this, and the apartheid did not change that much this, as I will show you later when I present series for South Africa. Now Brazil, this is another case, but as you know, this is the last country which abolished slavery in 1887, and at the time 1/3 of the population was slaves in 1887. So the legacy of inequality in Brazil is quite extreme. Now the Middle East doesn't have this, doesn't have the apartheid, doesn't have massive slavery until the late 19th century, but still has more inequality today. And of course, this just shows how the arbitrary frontiers between in the Middle East that were set up in the 20th century, the discovery of oil and the huge value of these oil resources, in the end has created a system of inequality that is in many ways more extreme than all the other inequality regimes that we've ever seen. So I'm not saying this is the only reason for instability and various problems, but this must be important somewhere. This kind of extreme concentration of resources, the fact that you have small territories with huge resources where people don't know what to do with the money, and some other territories a few hundred kilometers away who are in complete poverty with very limited hope for the young generation. So I think when we look at inequality, I think you had this World Bank report after the Arab Spring saying, well, there is not that much inequality in this country. What are they saying? But first, within country inequality are underestimated, and next, I think sometimes people compare themselves outside their own country. So looking at inequality just at the level of Egypt or at the level of Lebanon, maybe it's not the right comparison, because people, in particular the young generation, they can compare themselves with other young generation in other countries, at least in their region. So looking at inequality at this broader level, I think is important. So at this stage, what are the conclusions at this stage for this very first part of the presentation? I think like other countries, and probably even more than other countries, we will need to have more transparency about income and wealth in the Middle East. I think progressive taxation of income and wealth and inheritance is a powerful way to produce information, also to fight corruption, to limit concentration of property, even if the tax rates are not very high for income or property or wealth. Just publishing the data by income bracket, wealth bracket is very important, because in some cases, it would allow civil society to realize that the government maybe is not applying the tax law as well as it should. If you break down the data by city, by region, in Lebanon or in other countries, and I think it's very difficult to build trust in government if you keep this kind of data secret. There are other parts of the world where this data is secret. Like in China, you have an income tax, you don't have income tax statistic, but even China is starting to publish a little bit of this data, and of course China, it's not a democracy, there's not public deliberation in parliament where you vote taxes. So in a country like Lebanon, there is a parliament, and I think it's important that this kind of data is made public. Now, progressive taxation and transparency is not enough, and ideally, I think the issue of regional political integration. I'm certainly not saying that's simple. I'm not saying that the European Union is a model for Middle East Union or an Arab Union. It's certainly not working very well. But at least you have some form of redistribution of tax resources through regional investment funds, and which can be quite large. The regions that are the less developed benefit from the tax revenue of Germany, of France, and this allows gradual catch-up. It's certainly not working perfectly well, and I can see why Qatar would prefer that you have to ask them all the time, please give me 1 billion. But at some point it's better if it's organized in a more democratic manner, a more permanent manner. And I think this is an issue which will come again and again. And so some people will express this in a violent way, invading other countries, whatever, but I think it's possible to express the same kind of concern in a different way. And of course, the attitudes of Western countries towards this very extreme inequality regime of the Middle East has been full of hypocrisy for very long, because countries like France in particular, they like to give lessons about democracy and social justice, but then they are happy to make deals with the oil kingdoms in order to get a little bit of the money for their football club or to sell guns. And then, of course, for the Middle East youth or for the youth in Egypt or whatever, these lessons about democracy and social justice, are not so convincing. So I think this, sort of protection of the status quo that has been there for so long, of course, there is a big responsibility there, but this doesn't mean that the solution cannot be found within the region. So, this is a very broad perspective on inequality in the Middle East, but which I think is important to have in mind to begin with. Now, in the rest of the presentation, I will talk more about what's in the book, and at the end, I will return to the Middle East and also to what we know about Brazil, South Africa, as compared to the Western evolution. But the first 2 points of this presentation, on the long-run dynamics of income inequality and then on the evolution of wealth, will be mostly based on data, based on Western experience and Europe and North America in particular. So let me start with the first point about the long-run dynamics of income inequality. So, the main conclusion probably of my book is the end of the Kuznets curve. So the Kuznets curve was an hypothesis that was formulated first in the 1950s by Simon Kuznets. So Simon Kuznets was a US economist who first computed the first national accounts for the US, the first computation of GDP, national income, and then his next step was to use the income tax data for the US from 1913 to 1948 to compute for the first time, a very important work, the evolution of the share of the top 10%, bottom 90%, the different groups in national income in the US between 1930 and 1948. And he came with a very positive conclusion in a way, which was a reduction of inequality in the US between 1930 and 1948. And from there came the hypothesis of a Kuznets curve, which was the idea that in advanced stages of economic development, you have a reduction in inequality and then a stabilization of inequality at lower level. This was a very powerful message in the context of the Cold War, because this was also a way to tell to the newly independent countries, please be patient, don't make mistake, don't become communist, just wait a little bit, and at some point, the reduction of inequality will come. So this was a very interesting work. This was, he had only one country over 35 years, but this was a lot more than what we had before, because in the 19th century or before Kuznets, people had been talking about inequality forever, Marx, Ricardo, but they had no data, basically, or very limited data, which limits what you can say, or sometimes puts no limit on what you can say. So at least Kuznets had a country. Now the problem, what we have done in our work, in a way, is just to extend the work of Kuznets, except that we are in 2015 and not in 1953, so we have 60 more years, and we have more than 30 countries instead of one. And this leads us to quite different conclusion, which is that the reduction of inequality that Kuznets saw between 1930 and 1948 was really very much related to the shocks of World War I, World War II. In particular, the fact that these shocks induced a complete change in the policy regime with the rise of the New Deal, the rise of progressive taxation, the rise of welfare state to a various extent in the US and Europe. And these are really these political determinants of inequality that are led to the reduction of inequality in the 20th century. So just let me show you the data for the United States. So this is the share of total income going to the top 10%. So this is the decline in inequality that Kuznets found. And we agree with Kuznets. He didn't have Excel, but he did the computation right, and there's no problem, except that you have what happens after 1980, where you have this huge increase in inequality. So when you look at 2012, which is the latest data point here, you can see that the total inequality, including capital gains, is even higher than in 2007, which was right before the crisis. So of course, capital gains declined in 2008, 9, 10, because this is not a good time to exercise your stock options or to make capital gains right in the middle of the crisis. But then in 2012, it goes up again, and you are even higher than the previous point. And even if you take away the capital gain altogether, you can see that you have a general upward trend that is quite strong. And you have to ask yourself, where is this going to stabilize? Where is this going to stop? So, some people seem to believe that wherever this is going to go is fine, but here we are talking about big orders of magnitude. When you go from 30 to 50% of total income going to the top 10, is it going to stop at 60, 70, is it going to stop right at 50? So you want to understand what are the economic forces that lead there. So one way to try to better understand this is to compare this to other countries. So in the next two graphs, I will compare this evolution to Europe and Japan. I will move from time to time in this presentation. Sometimes I will show you annual series so that you can see the effect of crises and all this chaotic short-run evolution, which are an important part of the story. And sometimes I will show you decennial averages so that you can focus on the long-run trends. And both capture an important part of what we should care about. So let's look at so this is a long-run picture. So the US, the US is just the same as the previous one, but taking decennial averages. And the other one is Europe. So here Europe is a complicated continent. So here what I call Europe is a GDP-weighted average of France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Sweden. So it's not all of Europe, but it's a big part of Western Europe. And the evolutions are relatively similar as compared to the US. So you can see that Europe used to be more unequal than the US a century ago. And in fact, at that time, as we will see later, the US invented very progressive taxation of inherited wealth and income in the interwar period because they didn't want to become as unequal as Europe. And of course, today the situation is very different, but this was the case a century ago. And in effect, the US became more inegalitarian than Europe because Europe, going through the world wars, you had a huge decline in the concentration of property. You have an increase in inequality in recent decades in Europe, but it is much less spectacular than in the US. If you put Japan, the rise in inequality in the recent decade is sort of intermediate between Europe and Japan. Between Europe and the US, and in some way closer to Europe. So how can we explain this evolution? Given we are talking of countries which are very close level of per capita GDP or per hours of work GDP. You take Japan, Germany, Sweden, US. It's very, very close, very close. So why is it that you have this different evolution? You see that you need something more than just globalization. Sometimes the stories that we tell for rising inequality is simply something like this. China enters the world labor market, so you have all this pressure on low-skilled and medium-skilled workers in developed countries because they are in competition with Chinese workers, and that's increasing inequality. And there's not much we can do because globalization is good for emerging countries, so we just have to live with it. Except, so that maybe that's part of the story, but that's not enough because globalization happened not only in the US but also in Japan, in Sweden, Germany, in France. So why is it that you have this different evolution? So you have rising inequality everywhere. You have sometimes a lot of unemployment in some European countries, but this is taken into account here in the total inequality, which reflects inequality of labor income, capital income, everything. And in the end, you have quite different evolution. So you need more than just globalization. So probably nobody knows the complete explanation. And in my book, I try to offer some interpretation, but certainly, you know, the full explanation is due to a mixture of reasons, you know, probably more unequal access to education in the US with very high tuition fees, so I don't know if this is something I should say here at the American University in Beirut, but you know, in the US, you know, of course, you know, there are great universities, as we know, Harvard, but you know, the bottom half of the population, not only they don't go to Harvard, but you know, the quality of the high school and community college they go to is sometimes not so good, and so there's been a growing gap in terms of quality of education between the bottom part of the population and the top part, probably more so than in Europe and in Japan, and you know, this could be, you know, the most standard sort of economic model of supply and demand for skills. This could be the most obvious explanation for why inequality has increased so much in the US. Now, that's not enough, because you also have an unprecedented rise of very top managerial compensation in the US, which is difficult to explain simply on the basis of education and productivity. And here you have, I think, to also to address the role of corporate governance, changing incentives, the changing ability of top managers in the US sometimes to put the right people in the right compensation committee, and you know, this has little to do in some cases with the invisible end of the market for skills. And I think changing the tax system also probably have played a major role, with huge decline in top income tax rate in the US, which have changed incentives for top managers to increase their compensation, changing minimum wage, changing role of unions. So there's a whole set of institutions in education policy, labor market policy, which probably play the role. So let me just show you maybe one example to illustrate the, you know, unequal access to higher education in the US. So this is a graph where you have parental income and percentage of the population who access college. So this was measured in the US a few years ago, you know, 2012 to 2013. So as you can see, you get a straight line, and this is almost the first diagonal. You know, it goes almost from 0 to 100. So when you're, well, not quite, when your parents are very poor, when they are in the bottom 10%, you still have a 20% probability to make it, to go to college. And when your parents are in the top 10%, I don't know, can you? I'm sorry.
Thank you.
No, I have to do everything. I have to get the presentation. Okay. And so where you are in the top 10%, you don't have a 100% chance to make it. You just have 95%. Okay, so this is not the first diagonal. This doesn't go from 0 to 100. This goes from 20 to 95. Okay, but this is still quite frightening, you know, because I think this is an example where you know, the gap between the official discourse about meritocracy, equal opportunity, etc., and the reality of what we see is quite big. So I think, you know, we should be, you know, the elites have always a lot of imagination to justify inequality and to justify why they are the winners and why others are the losers. So you have all this discourse about meritocracy. But, you know, and sometimes these claims are justified and sometimes they are not so justified. And I think it's important to put these kind of claims under public scrutiny and to have more transparency, not only about income tax data, but also about access to public goods, access to education, access to other public service, so that we know really, you know, who benefits from what public spendings. And, you know, in this case, you know, it's even worse than that, because the college you go to when you are in the top are not the same as those you go to when you are in the bottom. So, you know, in my book, I give some data. I show you the average income of the parents of Harvard University undergrad right now in the US corresponds to the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution of family income, which, you know, is quite extreme. So this doesn't mean that there's nobody from below the top 2, but this means something very precise statistically, which is that the people who come from below the top 2 are so few, and the people who come from the top 2 are so high within the top 2 that the overall average is as if all students have been picked at random within the top 2. So again, the gap with the official meritocratic discourse is quite strong. So I think, you know, there's been some attempt in the US under President Obama to increase investment in public universities, community college, but this was very limited, and this is an issue that is being discussed a lot in this campaign with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. But I'm not sure this is going to change that much in the near future. But this is a very important issue, which of course contribute to explain the very high level of inequality that we see in the US and limited opportunity for the bottom group. This is certainly not saying that the situation in Europe or Japan is excellent in terms of equal opportunity, but I think it's a bit less extreme from the data that we have. Also, there's a lot of hypocrisy everywhere. In my country, in France, we are able to put 3 times more public resources per children in the elitist schools as compared to what we put in the normal university where the more disadvantaged students tend to go. So, there's a lot of hypocrisy in every system, and it's not enough, certainly not enough to have a free public education, to have equal access to high-quality education. So, no country is in a position to give lessons, but these are issues that need to be studied more carefully everywhere, and the modern meritocracy is to a large extent, I think, an illusion, and it's important to be aware of that. Now, let me move to the second point about wealth accumulation. So, inequality in wealth is to a large extent determined by inequality in labor income. So, everything I have said about inequality in education, labor market institutions, this has an impact on the inequality of labor earnings, and in the long run, this has also an impact on the inequality of wealth accumulation, because wealth accumulation comes largely from saving out of income. But there are other mechanisms which also play a role, because some wealth is inherited, so inheritance is important. Some wealth takes the form of natural resources like oil, which has not been saved by anyone, which is just there. Some other mechanisms that play an important role include the financial market, the financial stock prices, real estate bubble. So all these mechanisms have a role to play. And so the general conclusion I find in my book is that, contrarily to what you sometimes read in economic textbook, there's no wealth-to-income ratio, so the total value of what people own as compared to 1 year of national income, is not stable over time. It varies for all sorts of reasons, some purely economic, some more political. And what we see in recent decades is a gradual increase of wealth-income ratio, which seem to be returning to very high levels in rich countries. And the intuition is, well, part of the intuition is that, of course, with the decline, the slowdown of productivity growth, but even more so of population growth, if you have aging population, then wealth accumulated in the past can naturally become very important. Now, this is not necessarily bad in itself, because it could include, again, sort of the natural consequence of an aging population, except that in practice, it comes with a lot of concentration of wealth, a lot of inequality of wealth within each age group, and it raises new policy challenge about financial regulation, about more generally the regulation of property relations with new forms of capital, new forms of ownership, including immaterial capital, including the role of how you organize the governance of modern companies through worker co-determination or other scheme in non-profit sectors. Sometimes, so there are many different new issues about the regulation of capital that arise in a world where the total value of capital is different. So, just to start with the long-run picture in Europe, you can see Germany, France, UK, until World War I, the total value of wealth was between 6 and 7 years of income. It fell a lot following World War I, World War II. Destruction is only 1/3 of the fall. The other 2/3 are due to the lack of investment, to the fact that between 1910 and 1950, most of the private saving was used to actually pay for the war, which itself was used to destroy the rest of the capital stock. So this is a really stupid story, but this is the story of Europe over this period. And the other third is due to change in the policy regime. So like if you have rent control or nationalization, you reduce the relative price of capital, which doesn't mean that you reduce necessarily the quantity, and this is not necessarily bad. So the market value of wealth and the social value of wealth do not necessarily coincide, and here we are talking about the market value. You have this recovery after the war, partly because of reconstruction, reaccumulation of capital, partly also because of change in the legal regime with the end of rent control, the privatization at the end of the period, which increased the relative power of wealth owners and the relative market value of assets relative to other goods. So if you decompose by categories of assets, you can see in the very long run that agricultural land has disappeared. Well, it's still there, but it's not worth much. So you could be rich as a landowner in the 18th century in Britain, but today, even if you own all of Britain, it's not going to get you very far. Housing assets are more important, and other business assets are also very important. Net foreign capital used to be very important. It means that Britain owned big parts of the rest of the world until World War I, and then by 1950, 1960s, this was gone. You have the same kind of evolution in France, except that it took a bit more time for agriculture to disappear, and the net foreign assets were a bit smaller, but still very significant. Smaller colonial empire and foreign investment, but still very, very large, and this also disappeared after the war. If you look in the recent period, you can see the role played by housing in France and in Britain, and more generally, if you look, between 1970 and 2010, you have a very big increase in the wealth, private wealth to income ratio in all developed countries. Some of it is due to housing bubble. You can see Japan in 1990. You can see Spain in 2007, where the bubble is even bigger. So housing bubble means also when you have a ratio of wealth to income which is 500, 600%. So what this means is that if the average income in a country is 30,000 euros per year, the average wealth is 180,000 euros. So that's a ratio of 6. If the ratio is 2, it means that if average income is 30, average wealth is 60,000. So you can see the orders of magnitude. It makes a big difference when the total value of wealth is 6, 7, 8 years of national income as compared to 2 or 3 years. For instance, what this means, this has a number of consequences. This means, for instance, that if financial crises or housing crises are a lot more dangerous in the world here than here. Because if you make just a 10% mistake on the value of your real estate in Spain, if you start from a level of 6 or 7 or 8 years of GDP in wealth, 10% mistake can have devastating consequences for the real economy. Another consequence of this very high wealth value at the end of the period is that if you belong to the young generation and you want to become owner of an apartment in Madrid or in London or in Paris, and you don't have family wealth and you only have your labor income, this will have to be a very high labor income. Okay? So that's much more difficult to access real estate property if you don't have family wealth here than for the previous generation. So this has all sorts of consequences. This is not entirely bad in itself. Again, you could have a very high wealth to income ratio with a very egalitarian distribution of wealth. Everybody has an apartment, everybody has a share, it's a gigantic pension fund that owns the economy. So in itself, wealth to income ratio, this is not an indicator of inequality. But this can magnify inequality issues that are related to access to wealth and very high concentration of wealth. Another mechanism that is involved here is a gradual transfer from public to private property. So you can see on this graph the evolution of public capital as compared to private capital. So public capital, this is the difference between public assets, so public buildings, sometimes there are sovereign wealth funds, but for these countries you don't have much sovereign wealth funds, but you have certainly public buildings, public universities, public schools, hospitals, minus the public debt. Okay, so this is net public wealth. So when I talk of wealth or capital, it's always net of debt, of course, because you have lots of assets and a lot of debt, you're not rich, so it's always a net wealth concept. So you can see that public capital has always been smaller than private capital, which means that these countries have never been communist countries, which we all know, but it's good to check from time to time that we did not make anything wrong. But at the beginning of the period, even though this is not communism, this is a mixed economy. Okay, this is a mixed economy in the sense that the value of public capital is between 50% 1 year of national income. The value of private capital is between 2 and 3 years. So it means that the share of the public sector maybe was 25% of total wealth or 30% in total wealth in some countries. Given that there was limited public ownership in real estate, in agriculture, this means that in the big manufacturing sector or financial sector, you could have 50% of public ownership in Germany or in France or in Britain around 1960, 1970. Now, then you have a lot of privatization of these public companies. You have an increase in public debt. So if you have less public assets, more public debt, net public wealth goes down. And this explains part of the increase in private wealth, but only part. This is, I'm not going to say this is the only force, but look at the case of Italy. I don't know if you can read the series, but Italy is an interesting case because this is the country that has the lowest public wealth and the highest private wealth. And of course, the two are related because someone has to buy the public bonds and the public assets that you privatize. When you issue public debt or you privatize public asset, you don't sell it to the Mars planet. There is someone on Earth who buys it, and in this case, in the case of Italy, it's largely domestic Italian households who buy the public debt, who buy the privatized assets. This is not bad in itself. Sometimes privatization can be good for efficiency reasons. You have no problem with this in general. Now, when you come to negative public wealth, maybe this is a bit too small. Okay, so negative public wealth means that even if the Italian government was to sell all the public buildings, all the public schools, hospitals, then this would not be enough to repay the public debt. Okay, so this is what negative public wealth means. So I'm not saying the Italian government should do that. Many people would be shocked if we had to pay rent to the private owners of the primary school to which we send our children. But in a way, this is already what we are doing, because when you pay very high interest payment to the owners of the public debt, and the public debt is higher than the public assets, it's the same thing. It's a bit more abstract because it goes through the financial intermediation system, but it is the same mechanism, and this limits the ability of government to invest in education, invest in public infrastructure. In the country like Italy right now, interest payments are like 5% of GDP as compared to a total public university budget of the order of 1% of GDP. So is this the best way to prepare the future? It is not so clear. So these are important issues. There are examples in history with big debt repudiation, in particular after World War II, where many European countries, in particular Germany, never repaid their public debt because the choice was made to invest in the new generation, invest in the future, invest in growth. And I think it's important to put this kind of discussions that we have today in this kind of historical perspective. It's also important when we talk about public debt to look also at the public wealth and at the private wealth. Otherwise, we don't have the full picture. Sometimes we feel we have to be guilty that we are going to leave a lot of public debt to our children, etc., etc. And of course, we should always feel guilty with our children, but we have to remember that we are also going to leave more private wealth to our children, at least for those of us who have wealth to leave, that we've ever left. So it's important to take. And in the case of rich countries, private wealth have increased a lot more than the decline in the public wealth. So it's important to collect this kind of information for more countries. I would be very interested to see this kind of evolution for other countries, including countries in the Middle East, but so far we are not able to do so. Let me accelerate a little bit and come to the issue of wealth inequality. Maybe you should tell me how much more you want me to speak, because otherwise, 10 minutes, okay, that's exactly what I need, very good. So let me try to come to this point. So far I've told you, I've presented you some results about the total value of wealth. Now the issue now I would like to say a few words about is the issue of wealth concentration. Why is wealth, why is the evolution of wealth concentration is what we observe. So in particular here I want to make the following point. In the future, to the extent that we will have a high gap between R, which is the net of tax rate of return, in particular for large financial portfolio, and G, which is the growth rate, then wealth inequality might reach and might return to very high levels levels that we observed up until World War I. And I think one solution is to develop more transparency about wealth. So let me show you one table about the evolution of billionaire wealth. So this comes from using the world rankings of billionaires compiled by Forbes magazine, which they started doing that in 1987. This data is certainly not perfect, but I think it's probably more reliable than what you have in household wealth survey with self-reported information, and which is very low quality on top wealth holders, and so we have to compare the data sources and use what we have. What we find here is that I look at a fixed fraction of the top of the distribution, and I find that the average wealth in this group has increased at a rate of 6 to 7% per year after deduction of inflation between 1987 and 2013, whereas average wealth per adult in the world, including emerging countries, including China, including everywhere, has increased at around 2% per year, and average income at 1.4. Well, this is because of the increase in the wealth to income ratio that I have shown you before. So, in other words, the top, according to this data, is rising 3 to 4 times faster than the size of the economy, of the world economy, and that average wealth in the world. So, of course, this cannot continue forever, because if this was to continue forever, the share of world wealth going to billionaire will converge toward 100%, which everybody would agree would be excessive. And I'm not saying this is going to go to 100%. I'm sure this will stop before that. But where will it stop exactly? Nobody knows, and this is an issue in itself. So it's important to understand why is it that we observe this. So let's make me very clear that when I do this computation, I look at this fixed fraction of the world population at the top. Of course, these are not the same people over time. You have a lot of mobility. You have some people who go down, some people who go up. So in 1987, according to Forbes, the top billionaires were Japanese billionaires, which everybody has forgotten their name now. And in 2013, you have Carlos Slim from Mexico. You have from Mexico, from Liban. Yes, that's a good question. But anyway, you have Bill Gates from California. You have all sorts of people who were not there in 1987. So you have a mobility in this group. You have some people who go down, like the Japanese billionaire of 1987. Some people who go up, and that's very good to have this mobility. But in principle, if we were in an equilibrium of the world distribution of wealth, these two effects, people going down, people going up, should more or less compensate each other, so that the average wealth in this group should rise approximately at the same speed as the size of the world economy and average income, average wealth. It's okay to have very rich people and poor people and middle people, as long as everybody sort of goes up more or less at the same speed. It doesn't need to be exactly the same speed. It could be 2.5% per year, 2% per year. But when it's 6-7% per year versus 2% per year, this just cannot continue for too long. So we have to understand what's going on. It cannot be just the idea that you have new entrepreneurs, because the fact that you have new entrepreneurs, a renewal of entrepreneurs, some people going down, some people going up, again, this cannot explain why structurally you have this increase at the top. So other explanation could include, privatization over this period, which was very important. So this means that, a lot of the new billionaires today, they benefited from very cheap privatization. Carlos Slim, he did not invent the cell phone. He became owner of the telecom, a big part of the telecom sector in Mexico, and many people believe he did so at very cheap prices. Certainly, Russian oligarchs who are very prominent at the top of the list today, they did not invent the oil fields or the gas fields, they just became owner of large part of public property at very low prices. So the good news is that there's not much left to privatize, so in principle, this is the reason this should stop. Now, another explanation could be that with financial deregulation, you have an increase in the inequality of financial returns. To see this, this data is interesting. These are the rate of return obtained by university endowments in the US. The only reason I'm showing this data to you is that at least these people publish data, so we know, we don't know much about the Forbes people, but at least you have 850 US universities with capital endowments, and they publish detailed information about their portfolio. So you can see that US universities are doing very well, 8.2% on average. So these are real return after deduction of inflation, after deduction of all administrative fees, management fees. So this is really the pure return to capital. So clearly they are not buying US Treasury bonds. I don't know why people buy US Treasury bonds, but I can tell you US universities have not done that for many decades. So they have sophisticated financial products, financial derivatives, commodity derivatives. They pay a lot of people to do that, but if you have a very large portfolio, it's worth it. Okay, so if you take the case of Harvard, who got a return of 10% over this period, their endowment right now is over $40 billion, and they spend only 0.3% per year in management fees, but 0.3% of 40 billion is more than 100 million. So if you can spend each year 100 million paying wealth managers, if this allows you to get a return of 10 rather than 8 or 6, it's worth spending 0.3. Now, when you have an endowment of 100 million, you're not going to spend 100 million each year in management fees. And if you have $100,000, you can ask advice to your friends or brother-in-law, but that's not going to get you very far. So, when I talk in my book about R versus G, it's important to have in mind that not everybody gets the same R, the same rate of return. So, in the textbook economic model, in principle, when you have perfectly functioning capital markets, everybody should have access to the same rate of return. You go to your bank with $10,000 and the next morning it gets invested in China and you get a world marginal product of capital and this is it. But the real world doesn't seem to work exactly this way. And some people get very low return. Typically you go with $10,000. If you manage to get protection against inflation, you will be happy. And you come with 10 billion and this is what you get. So, if this applies also to the individual distribution of wealth, you can see that this can generate, at least this can contribute. I don't know how much this contributes to this because this is data about university endowments. We know what we know, but individual wealth is more limited. But I think the right response to all this uncertainty and all these suspicions that such mechanism could exist is that we need more transparency about wealth dynamics, so that we can adapt our policy, and ideally we should be able to adapt our tax rate to whatever we see. So if when we have better data, we find that the top average wealth at the top is only increasing at the same speed as average wealth, 1, 2, or 3% per year, I will be happy to conclude that we don't need very progressive taxation. But if what we find that this is increasing at 6, 7% per year, you cannot say that 1% or 2% or even 3% wealth tax rate will kill the process. So that's it's important to have this in mind. Now, in terms of taxation, as you can see, the history of taxation is sometimes complicated and unpredictable. So nobody knows what will happen in the future. 1 century ago, so this is the evolution of top income tax rate in 4 countries. So 1 century ago, there was no income tax. And many people thought there would never be an income tax. And then, the income tax was created, and in the US and also in the UK, the top income tax rate were 80–90% during many decades. In the US, between 1930 and 1980, it was 82%. So this was only a very, very large income, typically above $1 million in annual income, which probably explains why this certainly did not kill American capitalism, probably because paying top managers many $1 million is not so useful. So this, if this had been applied to everybody above $100,000, probably the outcome would have been different. So it really depends on what kind of income level you apply this kind of tax rate. The evidence is that the growth rate, and particularly the productivity growth rate of the US economy, were actually higher in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when you had this top tax rate of 80% than what they have been since Reagan, since the 1980s. So, I know, many people are not ready for a quiet discussion about this, and, it's very difficult to have a quiet conversation about taxation, but I think it's important to look at this evidence again. This is for In top income tax, this is for top inheritance tax, and you can see again that the US and the UK have gone very far in terms of redistribution of wealth through inheritance taxation, much more than France and Germany. This is also because in France and Germany, the destruction due to the war and inflation did a lot of the job, did a lot of the wealth distribution. So in the US and the UK, progressive taxation, which I think is a better way than destruction to redistribute wealth, was used much more intensively. Let me conclude by saying, returning to what we know about, inequality in developing countries. As I said at the beginning, there's need for more data access, there's a need to go beyond this Western-centered perspective on inequality. There's a lot of ongoing work on inequality in South Africa, Brazil, I have shown you a little bit Middle East, India, China. All this ongoing work suggests that official measures vastly underestimate inequality, and problems of financial transparency and tax havens, I think are even more problematic in Africa or in China or in Lebanon than they are in Europe or in North America. Everything we know suggests that looking at more data changes quite a bit the perspective. I have referred to the case of South Africa, where you can see this incredible level of inequality, much higher than France and the US. And after apartheid, this did not really change. Or if anything, this went in the wrong direction. Another example is Brazil, where, this was not in my book because we could not access the Brazilian tax data, and you can see that this makes a lot of difference, because the lower curve is the official estimate based on survey, and when finally we could access the tax data, the level is very different, and in fact, Brazil moves from being officially less unequal than the US to substantially more unequal. This is even more spectacular if you look at the top 10% income share rather than top 1%. You can see Brazil is with a combination of fiscal data and survey data that we use is a lot more unequal than the US, and the inequality is increasing, whereas with the official survey data it was declining. Now the problem in the case of Brazil is that we could not so far have access to the fiscal data before 2006, so we are not able to do the kind of long-run comparison I have shown you for other countries. So, according to the official survey data, which is used by international organizations, you have a decline in inequality in Brazil, but with the fiscal data, you have an increase. So what's, in the end, well, we don't know, because we don't have the fiscal data before 2006. So I think, this is a clear example where, I think it's important to have access to income tax data, even in countries, like Brazil, where you don't expect the income tax administration to work perfectly well. There's a lot of tax evasion, it's not perfect. So, but still, even if it's not perfect, it's better than the household survey data. So I think, it would be a wrong reaction in Lebanon to say, well, but the income tax data is not worth anything, don't look at it, the income tax administration is not working well, this is meaningless. But because I think, even when it's not working well, and especially if we believe it's not working well, we want to see it. And I don't think dissimulating that kind of data is the solution, and in some countries it changes quite a bit the perspective we can have. I have shown you this estimate on the Middle East, let me not continue, but I just want to say that from this simple combination, the Middle East seems to be even more unequal than South Africa or Brazil, so that's one additional reason to be interested. The final and probably even more important reason for going beyond Western-centered view on inequality is that I think we live a lot with this Western illusion that modern inequality is somehow more justified than more ancient form of inequality. That modern inequality is based on meritocracy, on equality of rights. But as I have told you, and when we look at the data for access to university in the US, meritocracy is to a large extent an invention of the winners of the system, and in practice there's very little effective equality of rights in access to high quality education, good paying job. You also have a lot of prejudice against particular ethnic groups which play a very big role in modern inequality, and in particular in supposedly developed countries. So like in France, there's a lot of discrimination, and in many other post-colonial societies, there's a lot of discrimination, in particular against Arabic or in particular Muslims, some being named, and a lot of studies have been done, sending CV with exactly the same degree and the same work experience, and if you're called Mohammed, you don't have the kind of job interview, you have 10 times less job interviews than if your name is called Michel. So that's something which many countries try to deny, but this is actually very important. You have debates in countries like India about quotas and preferential admission system based, in the case of India, on caste, or which are gradually being changed on a system based on parental income, which I think are very interesting. Sometimes in Europe or in the US, when people look at this kind of equal opportunity policies, they say, oh, but it's a different world, this is not an issue for us, we are based on equal opportunity, we don't care. But I think we should care. I think I'm not saying this is exactly the right policy, but all this discussion should be part of the agenda. And more generally, I think what I've tried to convince you in this presentation is that the history of income and wealth inequality is deeply political, social, cultural. It is not simply an economic history. To some extent, both Marx and Kuznets were wrong in the sense that there is no deterministic economic forces which lead either to increasing inequality or declining inequality. You have powerful forces going in both directions, and in the end, it's really which one dominates depends on the combination of policies and institutions that you choose. Probably the most important lesson, and I'm going to stop there, is the most important lesson from history, and this is why it is so important to put the study of inequality into this historical perspective, is that there are always many alternative ways to deal with inequality crises, to deal with public debt crises, and so the only advice I will give you is don't be impressed by those who know in advance what is possible, what is not possible, and the idea that there's only one policy that's possible. Look at historical evidence and make your own mind about these important issues. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Now, Professor Felix will comment on the lecture and book for 10 minutes. We also have question and answers.
You just right, I don't have a PowerPoint. So I'll go by my notes, and after this very serious but somewhat depressing presentation, I'll try to make it as serious but less depressing. I'd like first to thank Dr. Tarek Mitri and Nasser for the invitation, and also welcome Professor Piketty and your presence, ladies and gentlemen. I should start saying it's a great pleasure to be back at AUB, and of course in such a great occasion. And like Thomas, I have to apologize for my Greek English, which can be less comprehensive in a country like Lebanon than French English. I lightheartedly accepted, just before I boarded the airplane to come to Lebanon from Doha, to be here in this difficult task. And I started rehearsing what I can comment on in the airplane. And I realized that I was keep adding comments up until the time I arrived. And when the immigration officer asked me, "What's your name?" I almost said Piketty. So I'll skip given the time pressure, a summary of what I saw the book to be, and I'm very pleased to say I got it right in many different ways. I don't want it too close, I will start kind of punching it, right? And yes, you saw correctly, I'm shorter than Professor Piketty. So I will skip the summary and just say that I fully agree with the conclusion that in order to prevent an increase in inequality and economic and political instability, you have to do all the right things that Professor Piketty said. And I'll go through my written notes because, as I told you, for 3 hours I was rehearsing what to say and I didn't finish until I landed. So I want to contain myself. So, talking about inequality, I first wonder what kind of inequality it is when the author is given 40 minutes to present his thesis and I was given 20 minutes to read the 4 pages. So I will skip some of the things I have to say here. It's a very challenging task to comment on this book. As Churchill said, I can write a book in 1 week and 1 page in 1 month. Let me see how I started looking at this. Thinking of the student who visited his professor of economics after 20 years, and during his discussion the student saw on the desk of the professor the exam papers that the professor put that year. And he asked the professor, and he told him, "But these are the questions you asked me 20 years ago." And the professor replied, "Yes, but the answers are different." And this is something that happened to me when I have to chew what I taught my students up until 1989 and what I wrote actually then. I was wrong then. And first I told them, in 1989, this is the last year I will teach Marxian economics. Marxian economics in English means the scientific analysis of Marx. I don't know whether you have it in French, but the English differentiates between Marxian economics and Marxist economics. Marxist economics is the political interpretation and how you go to apply the lessons of history and Marxian analysis. And at the time, with the fall in Berlin Wall, I don't think that the debate would ever revive again, but now it's back. In this book, where some said has the very audacious title of Capital on the front page. But I was not only wrong on what I said, unfortunately I was wrong on what I wrote, in some sense wrong. Because at the time in a book that was not as big as Professor Piketty's, it had only 450 pages, I quoted what the world knew then by nobody less than Keynes, another economist who starts with K, like Kuznets. And what he said, Keynes, right in 1939, is the stability of the proportion of the national dividend accruing to labor is one of the most surprising, yet best established facts in the whole range of economic statistics, and this stability appears to be a long run, not merely a short period phenomenon. That was Keynes in 1939. And as a good student of his, I found out statistics not for 20 countries, but for England, that had then the longest time series. And at least with respect to the post-war period, the share of wages to GDP was 82 in 1949, 81 in 1979, and 84 in 1989. So indeed, almost 80% of the wages was, 80% of national income was wages in the 1980s, as it was in the 1870s when Keynes had his series. So I'm glad to see in figure 1.2 and in the other one you had on the capital share table 12.1, that at least the period that I covered is consistent with your data. I've been corrected, of course, on what happened after, but as we said with the old professor, the answers differ, but the questions are the same. After this cathartic introduction, let me thank Professor Piketty for making this book available to all Arab countries. But there is one Arab country that will not be able to read it. When I gave a talk in Brussels, I was asked whether Greece will leave the euro. And I told them, I don't know whether Greece will leave the euro, but for sure it will join the Arab League. So you had partly studied Greece, it was blue in Cyprus, but I encourage you to study it deeply, because this microcosm of these two Greek-speaking countries reflects all the ills that we have seen in the last 30, 40 years. And in fact, Greece, or rather the Greek people, proved me wrong again. What I used to teach my students in the comparative economics courses that I was given was that all societies condone all kinds of crimes, from torture, from beating up, even officially sanctioned executions and terror. But no society allows for open theft. Think about that. If a society allows theft just like that, okay, we call it capital accumulation here, but it does not necessarily have to be theft, no matter what Proudhon said, that all property is theft. But no society condones open theft. Very simply, if you have open theft, there is no trust. Worse, you don't have economic growth, and the rich will not be able to become richer. So where do we have theft? We have theft in Cyprus. We are all familiar when there is economic crisis, financial crisis, we have bailout. You bring funds from abroad to bail out the country. In Cyprus, they allowed the term bail-in. That is, if you have deposits in the bank, your private deposits, I can take a haircut. Imagine yourself going abroad for a month or two and giving your car to a friend to put it in the garage, and when you come back, says, no, you don't have a car. So this open theft happened under the modern rules of the financial system. And this is where the regulation that comes so clearly, the need for regulation that comes so clearly out of the book, is something that we have to consider very seriously. Right? Coming back to the Arab case, of course, Professor Piketty had a lot of diagrams in the region. But let me say something specifically for Lebanon. And I can say that without wanting to offend Lebanon, as Nasser said, I'm half Lebanese. We have stellar indicators here that are praised. The resilience of the economy, they call it, the resilience of the Lebanese economy. And the performance of the financial sector, the capitalization of banks. Against these stellar indicators, see what's happening to the real economy, which is suffering for very high bank charges. I don't know whether you've realized that, but I've been in 68 countries, and the banking system takes everything out of your deposits, justified in terms of charges. That's on consumer banking. In investment banking, Lebanon is lacking long-term financial investments because the banks don't lend for long-term. And if you don't lend for long-term, you can't roll over the debt. This is what drives the economy. Not short-term lending, but long-term lending. And of course, there are reasons for that, the instability and others. But worse than that, the real economy that we praise so much has no electricity, no water, no transport. And in fact, Lebanon is the only upper middle income country and the richest Arab country outside the GCC, the oil producers, where there are no pensions for private sector workers. It is therefore obvious, at least at face value, that in Lebanon the performance of the financial and banking sector exceeds that of the real sector. This is what Professor Piketty said, the R is greater than the G. As an anecdotal example, let me say something about the pride we all have that the president of Brazil is of Lebanese origin. If the real economy could keep the Lebanese here, Lebanon would have had a president. And we have not had a president now for how many years? So you can see the last slide, I think, which brought the political dimension. how allowing this kind of financial sector and wealth accumulation be rolling over, the impact it has on policy, on politics, and as a result on society. While the Koreans made a living out of exporting cars, the Lebanese, and also my country, make money out of exporting our people. And we take pride that the diaspora is much bigger than the people that we have here. With that comes, I think, the tendency we have of constantly blaming the others. And I think we should stop blaming the others. We look at the things that the book said, and we should not accept fatalistically that we are where we are because of geopolitical regions in the neighborhood, or religion, or whatever it is. I'm not referring here to the Middle East, and in fact the books are not written for the Middle East, but for all countries and all regions. Let me give you 3 examples of where the blame should be, or rather should not be, by reference to the Greeks, where we have demonized the Germans, and Schäuble, the Minister of Finance, and Madame Merkel. See how the British now, as a second example, are demonized in the European Union. And see also how the Austrians have glorified the far right, and not only them, and we have had many examples, including France, with the father of Madame Le Pen that continues today. Okay, let me start rounding up and say something about this book, the 700 pages that we have here, which I made the mistake to buy as soon as it came out at The Economist in London, at the basement of the London School of Economics. I saw it. I thought it was an interesting title. I didn't know what it was inside. I got to buy it. It was only available in hard copy at the time because they anticipated it will become a success. And I paid £50. That's about $80. Now you can have a bargain, have it for $29. And if I knew Arabic, I should have done the same because I have to confess, I'm still on page 457. I haven't finished it after all these years. So what the British at the time were saying about this kind of books, and I'll come to that because the English Anglo-Saxon economists got very excited, both in England and the US, about this book. What I heard there by my fellow professors was, with reference to the French, that in France the PhDs are 1,000 pages, and you cannot publish a single article out of them. In England, our PhDs are 100 and 150 pages, and we can publish 3 papers out of that. The French are so diffused and so unfocused. Now, this makes me think that it's correct for the British to say so, because if otherwise, we wouldn't have had the phenomenon of Mrs. Thatcher and neoliberalism that was praised so much until 30 years later, in 2008, we realized that we have a global financial crisis. And that global financial crisis has been best described by the ILO, the International Labour Organization, as global financial and social crisis. What has happened, for example, in Greece after that, and now we're talking about recovery in the next 99 years. That was the end of the privatization process that we said. Unemployment is not expected to go back in the next 20 years. 200,000 Greeks have left, most of them educated, all in a period of adjustment. So, what happened after 1979, I think it would not have happened if the Brits and the Anglo-Saxons would not publish essays rather than papers rather than essays. And of course, 1979, 1980, when all things started going wrong, if you remember, it was the year Mrs. Thatcher was elected in April, and January 1980 was Ronald Reagan on the other side of the Atlantic. So let me conclude with a book, and as a commentator, I have to say, not my criticism, but the criticism has been made of this book. One is a question I also asked my students, and it was, Marx made a lot of mistakes, but was he wrong? And to my pleasant surprise then, my students provided the right answer, though someone told me that this might be because of fear, rather than I convinced them. I don't think so, by the way. The second criticism is on whether, I can skip that one actually, because it's a little bit long, and go to the next one, which is Professor Piketty has been criticized about the data that has been used. And if you look at the period between, I think, March and June 2014, I got about 28,000 hits on the Google search Piketty comments, right? Who commented on that. And from that, I will pick up just one of the answers that Professor Piketty provided to the charge that his data were arbitrary and the analysis was sloppy. That was read in the New York Times. Your answer was, I'm right, and all is explained in footnotes. And I agree with that, and that's my final criticism. It is extremely difficult, and that's why I'm on page 456, when I read in bed and I have this book on my chest, and I read a sentence here, to go at the end and read endnotes. So the endnotes in the book are how many? 80 pages. There are 80 pages, and all of them cover about 15% of the book. So I don't know about the Arabic version. Footnotes? That's very good. That's very good. Sorry, I take it back then. But I hope the Greek edition, if it's not coming, it will also have a footnote. So let me conclude with that and say that I personally need to have a new edition of my book and revise some of the things I said. Though if Keynes was wrong at his time, perhaps I was justified to be wrong in my time. Second, yes, I would welcome Professor Piketty's translation of the book in Greek, and also the book to have footnotes. Third, the book, as the book shows, that while it is possible that the accumulation of capital is a historic fact and an unavoidable market tendency for for wealth concentration to increase, and that there is a difference between markets and competitive markets, the government, including that of Lebanon and my own country, has a lot of work to do. And in doing so, the governments and also trade unions should take note both of Professor Piketty's writing and also of an old friend who wrote, "The credit system, with its focus on banks, big money lenders and usurers, gives to this class of parasites the fabulous power not only to periodically despoil industrial capitalists, but also to interfere in actual production in the most dangerous manner." The person who wrote that was an old friend, Karl Marx, writing in 1987 in the volume 3 of Capital, who also said that the handmill gave society the feudal lord. The steam mill gave society the industrial capitalist. And I think with this edition of Capital, what we can add is that the modern society has replaced the slave owners and industrial capitalists with financial capitalists who, as invisible investors, are effectively speculators in unregulated markets. So I think now with globalization, which was the end state according to Marx, we've come full circle with this book, from the feudal lord to the industrial capitalist and to the financial capitalist. And since the whole thing started with Marx, I would like to ask, as a last question, Professor Piketty, whether he sees himself as The Economist, the magazine, put it, that is, as a new Marx. Although I think that epithet was said by The Economist, not as a compliment. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
We're going to take rounds of three. So we'll start with the first three. Let's start this with this side, with Adib and our colleague over there and over there.
Yes.
And please, just a direct question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Adib Nami. I work at the UN. But first of all, I want to say that it is a book extremely pleasant to read for adult economists, especially in French. Now, my concern is about what you said in your book, about that what you discovered is some kind of universal dynamic and universal law, which is R higher than J as and you base this universality on the fact that the economies that you study represent really the highest share of the global economy. But there might be some kind of qualitative differences between various economies and various regions. So my question is, does it apply the same way, and what is the size of the difference between what you discovered and what you described, and what may happen in our countries, where our countries are defined using the concept of patrimonialism of Max Weber as being patrimonial states with rather rentier societies, rentier economy. So does this dynamic really apply, especially when you presented your three main conclusions? One of them is that the importance of the political determinant of inequality. In our vision, it is not that they are more important, but actually politics is dominating the economy so that they somehow exclude what can be even an illusion of rational capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Piketty. I'm a Lebanese economist. My question is not on what you said, it's a methodological question. Capital output ratio occupies a very, your beta. It occupies a very important role in your book. And at one point, I think page 55, you use it as a measure of how capitalistic a society is. However, I was very surprised that you did not mention Luigi Pacinetti. Luigi Pacinetti, in an 81 book, Structural Strategy for Growth, made a very important theoretical contribution, whereby he distinguished between capital output and capital labor. Where capital output is a measure of capital intensity, capital labor is a measure of mechanization. And in fact, that theoretical contribution by Pacinetti resolved many important theoretical questions, like the Vygotsky paradox, some Marx organic composition of capital, and even the contributions by Soro. But there is no mention whatsoever in your book, although capital output ratio is very important, and you talk about it not as a ratio most of the time. You talk about the numerator, the denominator. And I think it would be a very important contribution if you address, first of all, this theoretical distinction about capital output, which is a measure of capital intensity, and where in your graphs of the United States, you see that capital output, which is capital intensity, has been falling for about 40, 50 years, which does not indicate how capitalistic the US economy is, but it indicates something about the charges, capital charges in the economy. So I would think that, if I may suggest you read Pacinetti, it would throw a totally different light on your analysis. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for the great presentation. Unfortunately, I've not had an opportunity to go through the book, but I just wanted to know that since you have, in so many words, advocated that free market economy would perhaps lead to more of wealth inequality because it would perhaps have economic growth growing slower than the accumulation of wealth, especially with reference to the so-called the third world and developing countries. What do you think are the in terms of a policy recommendation, what do you think is the role of financial institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, etc., when they very clearly work at the whims and fancies of the so-called developed countries, which you have studied clearly? So in order to have the progressive taxation systems which you have spoken about, is it really possible to even replicate a model like that without actually undoing the political implications which these financial institutions have? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for all these questions. Thank you, Zafiris, for your question. So I don't know where I should start. You asked me at the end, and then I will take the three questions. You asked me, do you consider your work as sort of following Karl Marx or what? Frankly, not really. I think my book is a lot easier to read than Karl Marx. That's for sure. I don't know if you've tried to read Karl Marx until the end, but to me this is a very painful reading. In the sense that it's I read it until the end because I thought I had to, and there are lots of great parts and intuition, but to me this is too theoretical and too speculative. My book is a book of history. It's a book based on archives, historical material. I mean, of course, it's a lot easier today this book was published 150 years after Karl Marx's book, so I have the entire history of the 20th century with a lot of data, the experience of the World War, the Bolshevik Revolution, all the post-war income tax data, etc. So it's a lot easier in a way to write a book full of data and historical evidence today than at the time of Marx. I'm not going to blame Marx for not having all the data, but still, I think he could have done more. There was a bit more than in the data of his time, and to me, the kind of writing is a bit too theoretical and too speculative. I mean, that being said, he was certainly, he was concerned with the basic fact that he was noticing around him, which was sort of obvious to many people at the time, which is that you had the Industrial Revolution, but you have a big wage stagnation until at least 1860, 1870, so during the first half or maybe the first two-thirds of the 19th century, you clearly have a big increase in the profit share, even if we are not able to measure it as well as today. You have a wage stagnation in the middle of a huge industrial expansion, with the misery of the urban working classes, which in a way was even more striking than rural misery, because this came in contrast with the huge industrial expansion. So this you could see, and at least as compared to contemporary economists who don't always care a lot about the basic facts that the social world that they see around them, he was starting from there. So this book is concerned with inequality, rising inequality, so it is in this same tradition if you want, but in this same tradition, but with a very different kind of writing, very different kind of research. So frankly, no, I don't really see myself as working in this tradition. The title to me means that it is time to put the study of capital and inequality in the 21st century, in the sense that this is also an age where we have a lot more information, a lot more data, and we need to readdress some of these key issues with a new perspective based on the experience we've had, and also with the feeling that, of course, Soviet-type communism was a gigantic failure, but this doesn't mean that we should stop thinking about capitalism and the way to organize property in a more equitable manner. There are different ways to organize property relation and to regulate property relation and to limit the concentration of power and property, and these issues need to be taken seriously, readdressed again. So at least in this broad sense, I this is in the continuation of previous writings. There was a number of questions that were. So let me try to answer. First, R bigger than G. Should we view it as a universal law, and how does it apply to Lebanon or to every country today in the world? Let me make very clear that I don't view this as a universal law. I think there's no natural law in economics. In the end, both R and G are determined by the legal system, by institutions, by political struggles. Capital itself is multidimensional, so the notion of an average rate of return to capital R is a very abstract intellectual construction. In practice, the rate of return to housing is determined by many regulations between landlords and tenants. Rent control. The rate of return to manufacturing capital depends on the state of labor laws, the role of unions, the way we organize wage negotiation. So all these different rate of return depend on different property relations. So capital is not just a thing that you accumulate, it's a relation between owners, workers, determined by many different aspects of the legal system, the institution, culture. So R bigger than G is summarizing in a simple equation many different forces which can lead to very different outcomes in different societies. So there's no, I certainly don't view it as a general universal. The only idea that I wanted to express with this simple equation is the following. If you look at pre-industrial societies before the Industrial Revolution, R bigger than G was completely obvious in a way because the growth rate was zero. Okay, so there was no growth rate until the growth rate was very close to zero until the 18th century. And the rate of return to capital, which was typically agricultural land, the rate of return to agricultural, of course, was not zero. It was typically 4-5%. If you read the classical literature of every country, you read Jane Austen, you read Balzac, everybody knows that if you want to have an annual income of say 1,000 pounds sterling in 1800 or in 1750, you need to have a capital of 20,000 pounds, so that 5% is going to give you 1,000 pounds. And the Jane Austen or Balzac or other writers in other countries, they don't even have to explain, R equals 4 or 5% in the footnote. And you're completely right about footnotes, and I'm happy to see that the Arabic version is footnote. The French version, which was footnotes, but unfortunately Harvard University Press, I had a big fight with them. Maybe I should have footnote. But anyway, it's a different one.
So,
yes, that's. No, I think you're right. I think a big part of the confusion is due to that. I think you're perfectly right because a lot of the explanation for the technical reader and for the economist are in the footnotes. And if you don't see them at the bottom of the page, you don't go at the end of the book and you believe they're not there. Well, anyway, Jane Austen didn't have footnote because she didn't need to explain R equals 5%. It's the same because everybody knew it. At the time, the reader in the same paragraph of the novel, she would go from the capital value to the annual return to capital, and everybody would understand. Everybody would say, and she met someone with a 1,000 pounds return, or someone with a 20,000 pounds capital, and everybody would understand the relation between the two. Because in a way, at that time, in pre-industrial societies, R bigger than G was the very foundation of society. This is what allowed a group of owners to live off their wealth and to do something else in life than to care about their own survival, and so they could just consume the rate of return. So you didn't have rising inequality because wealth owners would just use the return to their wealth to have a high standard of living, and so but just you had the perpetuation and the persistence of a high level of wealth accumulation. Now, probably the most important message of my book is that the modern industrial growth and modern, following the Industrial Revolution, did not change this basic relation as much as one might have expected. So, of course, the productivity growth rate went from 0% to maybe 1 or 2% per year in the long run, which makes an enormous difference in the very long run. But at the same time, the rate of return to capital also increased with the new form of economic activity, long run rate of return to to manufacturing capital or the stock market, maybe it's come to 6-7%. And in the end, the gap between the two did not necessarily change. And so when you have a rate of return of 5% and a growth rate of 1%, it means that you just need to reinvest 1/5 of your return to your capital so that your wealth keeps growing at the same size as the economy and you maintain your relative position. But you can still consume 4/5 in order to maintain a high living standard, so this is less than the entire return. But, so I think this logic allows to understand that in spite of all the huge change following the Industrial Revolution, we need to put the study of inequality in an even longer run perspective, and that's maybe also another difference with Marx. Let me be shorter on the other question. So capital output ratio, capital labor ratio. I look at labor shares and capital shares, which is a sort of natural way to compare how much goes to capital, how much goes to labor. Capital labor ratio is not so well defined because how do you measure labor? If it's just the number of workers, and clearly, and capital is the value of capital, then the ratio is going to infinity. It's increasing enormously. If it's the efficiency units of labor as measured by the productivity of labor, then it's what you get also by looking at the capital share, labor share. So I think maybe there is some confusion here, or probably I could have been clearer about this. Last question about World Bank and IMF. What could be the role of World Bank and IMF, and what has been their role in particular if we want to promote more progressive taxation? Well, I think international organizations in the past 13 years have played a relatively negative role in terms of fighting inequality, and they've been promoting a view of tax reform which has been very much anti-progressive taxation and always promoting increasing indirect tax, etc. Now, today they say they have changed, and now even the IMF, they say they are concerned with inequality, etc. But I think they still have a long way to go. They are, when you see what they are doing in Greece, when you see, I don't think, I don't know if Egypt will have an IMF program in the next few years, but I don't wish Egypt to have that. I think the attitude of IMF in terms of structural reform and tax reform is still very conservative, and they want to increase indirect taxation all the time. And, they are starting to say that they want to fight financial opacity, that they are in favor of fighting tax haven, automatic transmission of information, but they have not come with the corresponding conclusion regarding the tax system and progressive taxation, and that's maybe at some point they will change, but there's still a long way to go.
Okay, we'll take probably the last round because of the time. We'll just start on the front row and then we'll go. And then we'll end. So we'll take 4 questions. I know we were delayed, so that's the reason. Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Muhammad Ammar. I'm a political science graduate and autonomy economics as a second degree. My question is simple. It's related to economics and history at the same time. So Professor Zafiris have mentioned that the Economist magazine have mentioned you as the new Marx. But my question is not from a Marxist view. You've mentioned about patrimonial systems in the Middle East, and we can say that feudalist systems and patrimonial systems have always ended through war, especially in Europe, the feudalist system, in Spain, the Civil War, and the recession, the depression in 1929 was followed also by a world war. So many analysts today say that the current system will also collapse and will lead to world war or something like that. So many people also start talking about post-capital system in the world. So as an economist, can we say that this might happen, or what is the solution?
Ibrahim Hanna, I'm an actuary, and I have a technical question since I don't have the footnotes in front of me. You talk about the public wealth, and as you said, this is net of public debt. When you talk about the public debt, have you taken in consideration implicit debt as well?
My question refers to what Dr. Zafiris pointed out on geopolitical wealth movement and interventions in the case of Cyprus or the case of Palestine, and how are your perspectives on the movement of economic support schemes to different economies of the world, the Greater Arab Free Trade Area versus, for example, the Euromed Treaty, and are there reviews that you're addressing not only by country but by region? Okay. My second question is, a lot of activists think that economists are not addressing real-time issues, particularly issues of environment and gender. And in your conclusions, you have not touched on that. Are there gender issues and environmental issues that are really factoring on all of these economic issues that we need to address and factor in all this perspectives?
My question is, what is the economic logic behind the privatization of public assets? Is it simply a desire to create new private markets, or is there something else to it?
Hello, Lara Halabi. I want to ask the elite, those who are maintaining the capital in their hands, can we consider there is two categories of elite, those who are in front of the light and those who are behind? So we know that there is people like families who have a long history in wealth, like Rothschild, for example, who is detaining the media, the oil, and other sectors who give benefits, wealth benefits, and they are in the dark. And the other category of capital people that we all know. So industrial, military, do you concern that the capitalism is now based on the military industries, because we see everywhere war, and those who are benefiting from this kind of military, and it's over the world.
Let me give Professor Piketty the last word. Very quickly, I asked this rhetorical question about whether you consider yourself as a neo-Marx. And my point was the following, that as you said, yes, Marx made the analysis before data and had a lot of inferences to bridge the gaps. But where I see your real contribution is in the following. 90%, if not more, of the economics we teach are, I will not label them neoclassical economics, but the economics we teach today is economics, as the definition goes, is the science that studies the pricing, allocation, and growth of resources. It's a purely mechanical exercise of what determines prices, labor demand, labor supply, and we put a single value on economic growth. If there is economic growth, everything else follows, and we ignore the quality of growth and changes that happen in the society. I see this book as one that addresses the issue not just of the economy, but economic system. How we have moved from an industrial society to a post-industrial society, which ended in 2008, 40% of all corporate profit in the United States was accruing in the financial sector that was employing 1% of the labor force. So the falling rate of profit that Marx talked about, looking at the what he had at the time, industrial capital. Yes, it is a little bit of a long shot, 150 years later, but now we have a financial sector that has saddled the whole world, and nobody can touch the financial sector, because this is the oil that greases the wheel, and you can see every day what is happening once there is any kind of change in investor behavior, which is totally speculative behavior, because it's on quick returns of the assets, the bonds, the equities that they can lay their hands. And the welfare of the society depends on the real sector, and the money and banking, financial and monetary sectors are there to help the real sector. And now all of us work in the real sector to feed this monster. So that was the basis of my question.
Okay, so yeah, let me answer very, very quickly some of the points that were made. Let me say that there are many limitations to this book, many important issues, in particular regarding the environment, gender inequality, which are not addressed, partly because of particular gender inequality. We don't always have the historical data on this, and for many of the periods I look at, the gender inequality was so huge in terms of control and property rights over property, with basically no rights for women. That the picture is quite simple, unfortunately, to draw. Now, for the more recent period, the more recent decade, there's of course a lot of change going on, and this is an issue that deserves enormous attention. There's also ongoing work trying to use our data set on the world distribution of income to look at the world distribution of carbon emissions at the individual level. So instead of just comparing countries to countries, you can compare the top world emitters of carbon, whether they are in China, in the world, and see really, try to define some notion of equity that is more based on individual rather than on country. So there is some work that we did last year at the time of the COP21 conference in Paris, which you can find online if you're interested. Is war, are wars the solution to inequality or the unavoidable consequences of inequality? I would not say that. Certainly in the 20th century, wars played a huge role, and I think it's important to remember the fact that to me, probably the most important empirical finding, which people were not so sure before this book, is that there was no decline in inequality and concentration of wealth before World War I. In particular, if you take a country like France, you have this, if anything, rising concentration of property until World War I, and for every European country that we have. So this is not saying that without the war nothing would have happened, but at least the story of the rise of progressive policies and progressive taxation in the 20th century is a story where wars and conflict play a huge role. Now in the future, we can do better next time, we can have more peaceful solution, but I think it's important to remember the difficulties for the elites to accept whether these are elites which play their role openly or more in the dark. And I think in today's world, maybe the novelty is that there's a lot of emphasis on the sort of very socially visible and useful entrepreneur and new entrepreneurial elites, which is often used as by the elites who are more in the dark, or where the social role is less obviously useful to sort of justify their position, and we need to be very careful about this kind of discourse. There's a new, very naive view that okay, we just need to wait for all these new entrepreneurs to give away part of the wealth they have created. We don't need taxation anymore. We just need to rely on private philanthropy. And I think this is very naive. When you look at the data, actually how much they give, this is much more limited than what they sometimes claim. And I think private philanthropy, if it comes in addition to taxation, that's very useful. But if it's instead of taxation, I'm not so sure this is going to work. So we need to be very careful about this new discourse. And of course, we need to recognize that sometimes some of the redistribution happens through conflict and wars, and certainly in this part of the world, this is something that is not over. But I want to believe in regional political integration. In Europe, this is not working well, but this is better even in the current situation than without it. And to conclude, I guess to me the main risk with rising inequality is that if we don't find blame particular groups, foreign workers, we try to blame migrants, we try to blame Muslims, we try to blame or Mexicans, in the case of Trump, and this is really the big risk with rising inequality. So in Europe, in the case of Europe, I think the new left-wing movement, like in Greece or Podemos in Spain, they may not be perfect, but I think they are much less dangerous than the extreme right-wing movements. I think the European governments, they should have tried to work in a more progressive and positive way with Greece, and now they have with Austria or with Marine Le Pen in France, or they will end up with these people who are a lot more dangerous than the extreme left. So I think yes, we should be very concerned about this risk and try to find a more peaceful solution to rising inequality. So thanks a lot for your attention.